And the today's adult forum is hosted by our affordable housing team. It's called COVID in the Housing Crisis. So we're going to talk more about the needs for housing and what does affordable housing mean. Deidre is the CEO of Common Bond, which is one of the nonprofit affordable housing developers in the Twin Cities. And we have most of our affordable housing team on this morning. So when I say your name, why don't you wave? Esther, I see Esther is here, and Michael Stetzler, and Anne and Gus Haugen, and Gary and Jean Olson, and Betchen, and myself. Am I missing anybody?
Is Diane with us? No.
Diane Larson.
Oh, yeah, is Diane with us?
Not yet.
I'm not seeing her yet, but Diane Larson is the other member of the team. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Deidre, and she will share a variety of things with us this morning. Deidre, thank you so much for being here today.
Speaker view.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. Is my sound working okay for everybody?
Yes.
Yes.
I have been having a few technical difficulties this morning, so I'm just trying to get myself reorganized. Thanks for your presence and for the invitation. Really appreciate it. So I was invited by Pastor Betsy to talk a little bit about affordable housing, and I would really love to keep this as much a conversation as possible. So I'm going to invite you in at a couple junctures to help guide our conversation, but I also want to leave a lot of time for questions. And, you know, it's a big subject, a big topic, and I want to make sure that the questions that you're bringing into this conversation can get answered to the best of my ability. And if I don't know an answer, I'll help you find it. So first, just a little bit about myself. So my name is Deidre Schmidt, and I am the president and CEO at Common Bond Communities. Some of you might be familiar with this organization, but for those of you who aren't, Common Bond is going to celebrate its 50-year anniversary this year.
Wow.
Yeah, it's for those of you who, I think a couple of you were around for its genesis. That's probably shocking. I hear some good laughter about that. You know, I too am mortified that I'm older than Common Bond, but anyway.
Yeah.
This is what legacy is about, right?
Yeah.
I'm really just very proud to be part of this organization and its third CEO. Common Bond was started by people of faith who had witnessed what was going on in the 1960s and the very, you know, threat to peace in our country and in our cities in particular. And these folks said, hey, you know, it's not enough to talk about these issues in church on Sunday. This group of people decided that they wanted to be active in making change in the world towards some of their ideals. And I have had the pleasure of hearing directly from folks who were there in those early moments of conceptualization. And it's really fun to hear that, you know, they literally sat around a conference table and said, what would be the thing that we could do that would be most powerful? And they debated back and forth, and they decided in a relatively short meeting, given the weight of the subjects, that housing was the place that they wanted to intervene. And they made that decision because they knew it could have immediate effect for individuals, meaning the folks that needed housing, needed stable, safe, and affordable housing. Their lives could be instantly made better. But they also knew that by doing that, and by doing it well, that they could change the physical shape of our cities and that they could start to build a more equitable society. And so they really liked this idea of being able to do both the intimate and the large scale at the same time. And that is exactly what Common Bond's been doing ever since. So we now work in 3 states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa, but our center of gravity and our home base is still right here in St. Paul, Minnesota. We house about 13,000 people now, and we also provide social services to folks who live in our communities, and to a limited extent, folks who are not residents of the Common Bond community. And this is really to help folks go beyond just achieving stability in their lives, but in pursuing their own goals, whether that's to help a kid, graduate and maybe be the first in their family to go on to college. Maybe it's saving to buy a home. Maybe it's living in their home independently as long as possible. We meet our residents where they're at, help them meet their housing needs so that they can pursue their greater aspirations and give back to the community, which is absolutely something that we see. Before I came to work at Common Bond, I had a varied career, but there has always been a through line of housing and always a through line for affordable housing. But I've worked in the private sector, for-profit side and nonprofit side. I've done non-housing real estate development, including culture facilities, office, commercial, but my heart has always been with affordable housing. And the reason why I have such a personal connection to Common Bond's mission and to the provision of affordable housing is, I can look back on my own life and I can see how critical a stable home has been for me in the midst of a life that had, a lot of challenges. I was never homeless, but I was always assisted, if you will, in focusing on other things in my life by the presence of a stable and safe home. And the first manifestation of that is when my mom, who was a young widow, and I lived in a trailer on a farm in western Wisconsin. And that trailer, which was a 1968 issue that was very modest, was a perfectly fine home for us. And in fact, I didn't know until a really helpful 8th grader, an older boy, told me that it wasn't a good enough home. I didn't know that it wasn't a perfectly fine place to live and build a life. Later, when my mother had gotten her undergrad degree, which she went back to get after my father passed, and we moved to the Twin Cities, my mom did what a lot of parents do. She found the most affordable apartment that would rent to her, to us, in a great school district. She said, really, that was all that she was looking for, is how could she get me into the Hopkins 270 school district? She was putting my long-term needs ahead of her, ease of commutes, et cetera, et cetera. And we were really lucky because as we were looking for a place to live in Hopkins, my mom was paying with Social Security and not Section 8, right? So a lot more landlords were interested and willing to take that as the form of payment. We were also helped out by the fact that we were white and English speaking. We weren't subject to some of the biases against people of color and new Americans. And I graduated from that school, Hopkins High School, and moved out from that apartment with my mom kind of the day after graduation. And I was able to work my way through college by living with a friend in a really super modest apartment. I mean, if I went back to it today, I'm sure I'd be appalled, frankly, but it was really what we needed at the time. I think between the two of us, we paid something like $215 in rent. And I was able to be self-sustaining in that way because of the affordability of that apartment and proximity to the university. And later when I bought my first home, which I'm still sitting in today, I was able to do so because I had a friend who was willing to help me out with the down payment. So I look at all of these, junctures in my life, and all of the opportunity that's been presented to me because I was able to obtain safe and stable housing. So I want to talk about this term affordable housing. And I want to invite you, for those of you who are willing and able, let's use the chat function here. So if you're not as familiar with this, there's a little bar at the bottom of your screen, and one of them is a speech bubble that says chat. Press on that, it'll open a window to the right. And I'd like for you to type in to that chat. To everyone, if you're willing, you can do it just to me if that makes you feel more comfortable. A word or two or several that you associate with this term affordable housing. So when you think of affordable housing, what comes to mind? What are the characteristics of the housing? What are the characteristics of the people? What does that bring to mind for you? And I'm just going to give a couple minutes for folks to share. Thank you for getting us started.
Sassy, go ahead. Poverty.
Yes, of course, we can all use our voices too, right? All right, so poverty. Also try to give me some thought of how you define it. So if affordable housing exists, how would you define it? How do you describe it? What are its characteristics? So I'm watching here, I'm seeing people talking about shortage, so that there's not enough of it, right? That it provides safety, security, opportunity for low income people. Someone's saying, maybe it's temporary. I'm not really sure if that's true, but that's something. Someone's saying really affordable rent, maybe defined as less than $1,000 a month. Someone's saying it's basic, it's modest, right? That the living conditions aren't, opulent, aren't luxurious, that it's built in multi-units. Someone's saying it's probably serving a single mom with kids. Someone's saying if it's affordable, the person is paying no more than a third of their income. Someone's saying it's probably not attractive. It might even be considered ugly. And then someone else is saying, maybe it's within my means. So these types of definitions, the reason why I wanted to ask the question is that, we use this term affordable housing pretty loosely. You hear it a lot, and you hear people refer to it as if it's actually a thing, as if it is a term of art, a definition that is standardized, right? And the truth is that whenever we're entering into a conversation about affordable housing, it's worth pausing for a second and asking the person you're in conversation with to tell you a little bit more about what they mean, because it isn't a well-defined term in common and public use, and certainly in discussions in a public meeting, for instance, or in a casual conversation about our community's needs. So I'm going to just see if I can be extra clever and share my screen. Let's see if it works, and if not, it's not the end of the world. It says host has disabled attendee screen sharing. Okay, you know what? That's fine. What I wanted to do though is just run through a few of the types of assumptions, the categories in which we're making assumptions when we talk about affordable housing. And I'll do this pretty quickly since I don't, it's a longer list and I don't have the ability to screen share it with you at the moment, but oftentimes it's worth asking when we're talking about affordable housing, some basic questions. When we say affordable relative to what, right? So In some countries, affordable housing, the standard definitions for government programs, set affordability relative to market, right? So if you're paying a rent that's anything below the average in a market, you're in affordable housing. Sometimes affordability is determined relative to a person's actual income. Someone wrote that in the chat. If I'm paying less than a third of my income, then gosh, that's affordable. Furthermore, we can ask, what is an appropriate percentage? What is an affordable percentage? And does that change as the person's income changes, right? So maybe 30% is the right percentage for someone who's making a moderate income, but very few higher earning families pay anywhere near 30% of their income for their housing costs. We have to ask ourselves the question, is it always rental we're talking about? Because affordable housing oftentimes gets discussed in terms of affordable home ownership. Is it subsidized? Does the government or another entity participate in its creation or participate in its operation in a way to make it more accessible to more people? And is that a requirement of our definition? Who is it owned by? Is it owned by a public entity, a private entity? Was it developed by a public entity or a private entity? Is it short-term? Is it the housing of choice? Does it represent quality that would entice people, or is it really kind of the housing of last resort? These are all valid questions, right? And I think sometimes people get fearful of talking about affordable housing because they don't think they know the answers to all of these, definition categories. And I just want to urge all of you to embrace the fact that these are not standardized and across the board definitions that we can assume when we enter into conversation. And so don't let an area where you are not familiar impede you from having a discussion and from asking questions and asking those you're interacting with, what do you really mean by that? I was going to show you a slide that I'll just describe to you. There's an organization called the Family Housing Fund, and they recognized about a decade ago that they were in conversations with so many different people about affordable housing, and that there wasn't a good and standard definition. And so they wanted to create something that described their own definition. And so their definition has 5 parts. So they did adopt a definition that says the housing should cost no more than 30% of income. They adopted a definition that said it should be decent and safe, meaning we don't want to achieve that financial affordability by just having it be a really terrible housing unit. But they added on top of those 2 fundamental foundational elements of their definition, 3 others that I think are interesting and not always true, but this is their aspirational definition. They thought that affordable housing should be appropriate for the family size. So that means that, you're not achieving affordability by packing in a ton of people into a 1-bedroom unit. They also thought it should be well located, meaning that it gives folks options and opportunities and choice around proximity to education, proximity to transportation and employment. And the final pillar of their definition is that it should be a community asset. And this is a really important one in the work that I do. I really feel that affordable housing should be something that that folks are happy to live next to and would be willing to live in. It's kind of a litmus test, right? Would I live there? Would I prefer my own home? Yes. But would I live in this housing? So again, I'm just urging you to think about this and be be open with people to talk about definition. Let's move on though for a second, because we could talk all day about definition. Let's talk about who needs affordable housing. So let's do this again in the chat. Some of you already offered this. Person previously said, gosh, I think affordable housing is probably most needed by single moms with kids. Let's see, put some things in the chat here and you can shout them out. Who are we talking about? Who needs affordable housing? Let's hear from you on this. Someone writes seniors, everyone.
Mm.
So, the truth is everyone needs housing affordability, right? And if we don't have housing affordability, we know what happens. We know, for instance, that the majority of low and moderate income renters report having sacrificed other important needs in their family in order to pay for their housing costs. This is whether they're renters or owners, by the way, because a lot of people who own their own homes are still struggling with affordability.
Mm.
So we know folks report close to 70% of people will report foregoing medical care, not buying medication they need, making compromises on transportation, childcare, and food in order to maintain their housing. And that's a large percentage, right? And it can be subtle choices, of course. And we're all making choices all the time, every day, right? Of what we do with our resources. But when you think about the consequences for people who are making these choices about whether to feed their kids fresh food or to be able to afford their rent, we can understand that that has, back to this theme of earlier, an immediate impact on an individual, on that kid. But it also has an impact on every single one of us, right? So if you have a kid that goes to school who hasn't received, a good breakfast, they're not focused at school. If you have a kid that goes to school after spending the night in a homeless shelter or sleeping on a friend's couch, how much are they going to disrupt the ability of that teacher to bring all the other students along? Anyone who has a child in the public school system should care about housing affordability. And, the COVID pandemic has made a much brighter connection for all of us in the importance of home to health, right? Housing, its quality, its affordability, its location has been identified as one of the social determinants of health for quite a while now, but it's never been as obvious as during these last 10 months, when literally having a home could mean that your health, was better assured. That home is not only the place that you would keep yourself safe from virus transmission, but it's also the place where you're going to school your kids and where you're going to perform your work. So yes, everyone needs affordable housing. We often concern ourselves with the affordability and availability of housing for people who aren't served well by the market, right? So some of us can get our housing needs met at and have that 5-point definition, right? It can be good quality, the right size for our family, affordable relative to our income, in an asset to the community. We can do all that by engaging with the market, right? We can buy on the marketplace what housing we need and want. But for many folks, the market isn't producing the housing that is affordable, accessible, and has any of those other definitions for them. And it can be for all sorts of reasons, right? The biggest is, of course, income. But we know that certain folks are disadvantaged in society and face biases against them in society. So as I said, when my mom and I were looking for an apartment in Hopkins, I realize now, it wasn't occurring to me at the time, but I realize now how much easier that probably was for us, because we were paying with a form of payment that didn't have a lot of stigma to it. And we looked like the people who were predominantly in ownership of that housing. There wasn't a fear factor about, oh, is this family going to bring in strange smelling food, or do they have extended family that's going to be over a lot, or any of those things that come up, right? So we concern ourselves as a society with the provision of housing, the access and the affordability of housing for people who face some of those barriers, for all those reasons and many more. So I talked about how we're all indirect beneficiaries of the provision of housing. I would say, again, this is where COVID has impressed upon all of us how we're indirect beneficiaries of people having housing, because the ability of more and more people to go home and shelter helps to support community health, right? Public health. The other thing I would say about what's happened in the last 10 months is that COVID has expanded, and COVID, the health, the crisis, but also the economic crisis that's followed it, has brought so many more people into a visceral understanding of what living on the edges, right? When you look at people who have lost their jobs or lost income, had to change jobs, have fewer hours, have businesses that are less profitable, more and more people are in touch with that stress and anxiety that it can produce to have your home, the stability of your home in question. But it's also brought so many folks who have never thought about this before, never thought they would be struggling, always thought that their employment was secure, et cetera, or that they would have the ability and choice to have two parents earning income versus having to have one at home schooling, all of these things that have gone on through the pandemic. More and more people are waking up to the fact that, wow, my life can change on a dime. And I think people are more open to the idea that some of the folks who benefit from affordable housing that gets built were maybe also in their position at one time, right? And that life can change, and that personal choice and responsibility are absolutely part of the equation of why people end up in a position where they benefit from a subsidized housing unit or subsidized rent. But also, life conspires against us sometimes. So I'm going to move on a little bit and talk about, we talked about these abstract concepts of affordable housing. I'm going to move on now and go into a little more depth into some areas of affordable housing that actually have been defined. And I'm going to just mention 3, and I'm going to spend about 10 minutes talking about a 4th area. And then I'm going to just open it up and see what all you want to discuss. The 3 I'm going to mention, but I'm not going to go into depth in until we have questions. The first is public housing. So public housing oftentimes is the image, the profile of housing that folks think of when they think of affordable housing. Many people will think about like Pruitt-Igoe, right? The notorious public housing in Missouri that was demolished after whatever 30 years in service because it had deteriorated so greatly. Oftentimes people think about poor management practice and crime, ridden public housing. Public housing is an area of housing provision where a public entity, as it is implied, builds, owns, and operates the housing over time. Again, I'm not going to go into a great amount of depth in this. I'm happy to answer questions about it. But I would say public housing in the United States has never been resourced at the level that's necessary for its success. And so, well, when I think about a lot of public housing, not all, but we do have these high profile public housing examples that are not ones we would want to emulate. And there are really solid explanations for why they ended up in the situation that many of them were in, and hence some of the demolition that's occurred over time. But I'm going to put that aside for a second. And I want to just say the reason why I'm putting these three categories aside to focus on the fourth is that these three categories that I'm about to talk about are actually not where the majority of new production of affordable housing to meet the need that we have in our communities is happening. So that's why I'm setting them aside. Public housing, virtually public housing is being built now. So while it is a thing, it exists, it's been under-resourced for years, it's not part of the current solution or a major move toward how we get affordable housing in our communities today. The second category is manufactured housing. Manufactured housing is, in this country anyway, still, this is starting to change, primarily for single family home ownership, and usually on land that is entitled to a single individual. There are exceptions to all of that, but again, at least at this point in its current form, manufactured housing is not an immediate large-scale solution to meet the needs for affordable housing in our communities. And the third category I'll mention is oftentimes referred to as NOAH, naturally occurring affordable housing. This is housing that has some of those elements of that 5-point definition from the Family Housing Fund, but not all of them. It's housing that's affordable by virtue of a list of potential dynamics, including owner choice, but also age and degradation of the real estate, to the point where something that was at one time a really attractive high-end product has now basically been allowed to degrade and go down market to the point where it's offering affordability in communities. There's a lot of efforts, including by my organization, to take that housing before it gets demolished, before it actually runs out of useful life, and improve it and improve its management. But again, that's about preservation of existing properties. It's not about new production. So the thing I want to focus on, this fourth category today, I want to focus on and just kind of paint a general picture for you, is the number one affordable housing production tool that we have in the United States. It's a federal program, and it's responsible for over 90% of all new affordable housing development in the country. And it's called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. It's oftentimes shortened to an acronym LIHTC or LIHTC. There's not a quiz, so don't worry about it. So let me just ask, let's just ask the crowd and say, okay, if you were going to create a new program for housing, what portion of the government, what department would you put that in? Who would you assign that task to? Anyone want to offer? Somebody says Health and Human Services. That might be a good one. That really would acknowledge the fact that we're not talking just about a physical structure, right? We're talking about all of these other things in life. Someone else suggested, how about HUD, Housing and Urban Development? Those are really good choices. virtually no one would say, I would like to give it to the IRS. But in 1986, when tax reform happened in the Reagan administration, that is exactly what they did. And so our primary housing production program in the United States today is run by our taxing entity, right? The Internal Revenue Service implements this program. The reason why it lives at the IRS is that it is a tax incentive. It is a powerful tax credit, as the name implies, which is given against federal tax liability to private entities to invest in this public good of affordable housing. So it's a tax program. It gives this incentive for private investment. It is a capital subsidy and not a rental subsidy. And I want to talk about that for a second because it's a really important distinction. The tax credit, and I won't go into how it works, but the tax credit basically gets large banks and corporations of all sorts to convert their tax credit for cash that they put in to the development of new properties and the renovation of existing ones. So for instance, Common Bond just closed a deal earlier this month, and US Bank Corporation brought a $6 million check to the closing table. They brought $6 million of cash into this proposed development so that we could construct the building. Now, having that subsidy means that we don't have to carry as big a mortgage, right? We don't have to carry as much debt on it. So it does increase the affordability for the folks who will ultimately live there. But it's primarily a tool to create new units. It's not a tool, and it's not structured to make sure that those units are actually affordable to the people who live in them. There are general requirements for deals that are built using these resources in order for the credit to work for the corporations that bring the money, but they're in general. So in general, this program is designed to build housing to serve people who make 60% or less of the area median income. And this, again, no quiz. So I'm going to just tell you, in the Twin Cities last year, at the median income for a family of four was $103,000. That's really high, by the way. That puts us in among some of the higher income cities like Boston. So anyway, 60% of that, as adjusted family size, is the maximum rent that can be charged in units created by this program, which means that there's kind of a ceiling, if you will, for eligibility for folks who want to live in those properties, but there isn't a floor. So you can make, if you have a family of four, you can make, $62,000 a year or $60,000 a year, let's call it round, for a family of four, and you can qualify to live there. And the rent for say you're going to live in a 3-bedroom can be no more than $1,600 a month. But for every dollar less that your actual family makes than that $60,000 a year, the affordability deteriorates, right? So again, this program provides the subsidy to the bricks and mortar, and it provides some guardrails or parameters for who can live there, as defined by income, and some parameters for rent, but not parameters that are adjusted to an individual family's needs. The other important thing to know about this program is that it does provide, like that $6 million we got from US Bank, huge help. but it doesn't provide enough capital subsidy, enough money for bricks and mortar, that's all you need, that you're just ready to go, right? You have to go as a developer like Common Bond does, and you have to find all these other pockets of money and contributions and debt in order to get all of the money that you need to make a building possible. It's also competitively allocated. So you can't just raise your hand and say, you know what, I have a great opportunity, I have a good concept, give me those credits, I'm going to get US Bank to give me more money based on them, and we're going to build this thing. You actually have to go in and compete because it's a scarce resource. It isn't sized according to the need in communities. And so you're fighting for those resources against projects across town, projects across state. The other thing that's important to know is that there's no requirement for communities to build this housing. And so if you don't have community support, you won't be able to move forward. And for that reason, some communities are suffering now because they haven't built this or enough other types of housing, frankly, to keep up with the pace of the growth of their workforce and their economies. This is especially true when you look in greater Minnesota, where I was on the governor's task force a couple of years ago on affordable housing. We did a tour of all of these greater Minnesota cities, and there are communities like Thief River Falls is probably the one that's suffering the most, where they can't grow their primary industries because there's just literally nowhere for anyone to live within a driving distance of their community. So, and I'm going to beat on this point just one more time because it is so important. We have these qualifying residents that can live in these properties, and that is well defined, but the rents are not adjusted to their actual income. And so in order for us to provide really true affordability to those with the lowest incomes, we also seek to obtain rent subsidies to pair with this housing in order to bring it into reach of the very lowest income earners. So as you can probably tell by the way I presented it, I have some critiques of this tool, of this program. It is not a program that I, for one, would create from whole cloth. However, it is the production program that we have in the United States. And it does have some strengths. One of a few of these I'll just share with you is that it is a federal program, which means that, it's every state of the union you go to will have this program in use. And that means that there's an industry, if you will, that's built around it, a set of capacities, because it's a known thing that's been around since 1986. So that means that it can be productive because there are a set of actors who have learned how to use this tool. But while it's a federal program, it also allows for a lot of state and local control. Each state, and in some states, individual municipalities get to choose how they direct these funds, what other goals they're trying to accomplish with them. It also is a really effective method to share risk and engage the private sector in production where public housing has no opportunity for that. It's bringing private money to bear on a public problem. The critiques that you hear most often about this program are that it doesn't serve the deepest need without being paired with rent subsidy, as I was just talking about. It's pretty inefficient in its use of resources. There's a lot of soft costs, a lot of money that goes into this process that doesn't actually buy a brick or buy a stick of wood or buy a kitchen cabinet. It pays for lawyers and accountants and the like. And it takes a long time. It's not unusual for an affordable housing development through the low-income housing tax credit to take 2 to 5 years from the time it is, a twinkle in someone's eye or the identification of a site to the time that it actually opens to start providing housing. So we do our work with the resources And we are constantly looking, of course, for new ways to do more and different kinds of work. But I wanted to go into depth on this program because when you have conversations in your community about affordable housing, most of the time, what people are talking about is this fourth category that I just shared with you. Again, I encourage you to ask questions, though, of people who you're in conversation with about these issues to make sure you know what they're talking about and they understand and they're able to articulate it. So I'd like to open for questions and see what you all would like to know more about.
People can put questions in the chat or raise their hand. It looks like Gary has a question.
Deidre, is the low-income tax credit for housing the only program that you use?
Here's how I'd answer that. It's not the only program we use. There are a lot of other federal and state programs. It is a program that is present in the vast, vast majority of new deals, which means, so let me talk more concretely. We might use the low-income housing tax credit on a project, but then have to bring in another program as well. So oftentimes we're using the low-income housing tax credit as well as CDBG, the Community Development Block Grant, right? Because remember I said that the credit actually doesn't generate enough money to build the housing. We need to go find other sources. Mm-hmm. So we're always mixing and overlapping the credit with all of these other programs that are meant to do, you know, complementary but different things, serve certain populations. You know, there are programs that are specifically for very low income people, like the home program. The home program rarely, if ever, can build a unit on its own or renovate a unit on its own. So it's oftentimes used in a complementary fashion in a low-income housing tax credit deal. Very few, and this is why I was stressing earlier, you know, over 90% of anything that's built or renovated that delivers affordability that's permanent through a regulated, you know, system, it includes the tax credit. It's a it's a really less than ideal situation when we only have, you know, when you think about the quiver, right? We really have one big arrow in our quiver and then a bunch of little like darts.
There's a question from Lee and Chris. What's your experience working with communities like ours who have a desire to help further a solution to affordable housing?
Yeah, so, you know, Common Bond works with all sorts of communities. We're in 60 different cities, and we have dozens of partners that we've worked with over time. And there's all sorts of ways that you as individuals and you as a congregation can be involved in affordable housing. And I have an acronym that I like to share. And it's actually the same concepts, and you can choose which of these you want to remember it by. I like to ask people to be housing divas, D-I-V-A. Or if you don't like that term, you could be avid, A-V-I-D, same letters, right? But here's what that comes down to. So if you're going to be a diva, you can donate. You know, there are plenty of opportunities in our organization and others. You can always find a place where you can put your own individual financial resources in service of affordability or accessibility for someone else. The I stands for invest. There are increasingly ways for individuals and institutions to invest in affordable housing, you know, alongside folks like US Bank, right? So in fact, I was just writing on Friday a recap for the Catholic Community Foundation, who made a a major investment in one of our investment funds recently, about 2 years ago, and we were kind of recapping what we've been able to do with their money. So there are opportunities like that for individuals and institutions. The V stands for volunteer. And this is sometimes something that gets, I don't know, I would say poo-pooed a little bit, right? People say, oh, I want to do more than that. But volunteerism is really critical in a number of ways. And I think the most profound is that it is the way that we make sure that folks both within a housing community and in the greater community connect with one another. It is true that most of the folks that live in any of our housing communities are from the surrounding community. Most people who move into an affordable housing development that we do have moved from a location that's within a couple miles of that site. But keeping that sense of being integrated in and part of the larger community is really important, and volunteerism does a great job at that, making personal connections to folks. And then the A stands for advocacy. And the advocacy can take all sorts of forms. It can be something really simple, like the next time you get a phone call, which I know we all got a lot of in 2020, to say, what's your view on this candidate's, prospects for being elected to Congress? You can say, well, why don't you tell me where this lawmaker or this candidate stands on housing? What is this person doing to further affordable housing? You can show up when there's an affordable housing project proposed in your community and the city council is considering whether they should approve zoning or other changes that are required. Most of the time that people show up in those councils and people who write letters and emails are the people who are against that housing, who say not in my backyard. You can be a voice to say yes in my backyard, yes in my community. Yes, I think this is important. Please, council member, give this full consideration. Please, planning commission, do this. And you can be really much more active in advocacy too, if you'd like. Plenty of opportunities through my organization, others, through the Minnesota Housing Partnership, the Homes for All Coalition, to go talk with lawmakers, to share personal experience, to ask hard questions of our lawmakers, right? To help them understand that these are issues that all of us care about in our communities, even the people who don't have a personal need for affordable housing, that we all see the value of it.
Deidre, there are a couple more questions in the comments. Does Common Bond build and manage the housing facilities? And where do you look for, or what do you look for in a potential site? What does our property look like to you?
Yeah. So Common Bond, I'll go through the functions. So Common Bond does develop affordable housing. So we identify sites and we purchase the land and we figure out what the market niche is, and we partner with other organizations and we do the design and we run it all the way through. We don't have a construction arm. So we work with a third-party architect, a third-party contractor, but we are the developer of affordable housing. We also acquire existing housing and improve it in order to maintain, preserve affordability and the buildings themselves. So we develop, we rehab, we property manage. Property management, I have to say, is in my mind the single most important part of our work. And the reason why I say that, and it's hard for me to say that because my career before I was CEO was all on the development side, right? So everything I did before now was really about, in some ways, the more fun part of our work, right? Because it's about like, oh, what is this building going to look like? And, who are we going to partner with? And who are we going to serve? All of that like generative part of the work, which I really love. But when it comes down to it, the ability for that housing to serve its purpose well and to be a community asset is really about the management. I'm sure many of you have seen a really nice building And if it's not managed well, it doesn't fare well over time, right? It starts to look pretty shabby. Nobody's taking care of it. If it's housing and the house rules and the leases aren't enforced, you can get some activity going on that you would prefer not to have in there. And so the quality and strength of management, and also the approach of management, being respectful of residents, is really important. And to me, that's where housing succeeds or fails, in that last of those 5 points of definition from the Family Housing Fund, being a community asset. It's not just about keeping up the physical property, it's about making sure that the folks that live in that community are engaged, that they are respected and respectful of that asset in that community. We also provide social services. So not to everyone at the same level, but we have a set of programs and services that are meant to be tailored to both individual and communities' needs. And so that package of functions, that range of things that we do, is really effective at, not only opening up opportunity, but then making sure that folks can make the best use of the housing opportunity to build the rest of their lives on.
And then the related part was, what does our property look like to you?
So I will say that, first of all, you all have a lovely location. Your church is in a gorgeous setting with proximity to nature, to good transportation, and in a community that enjoys a good reputation, right? So has a solid school district, et cetera, et cetera. So when you look at those kind of indicators, it's really, that your site is a really lovely opportunity. The other thing I would say is that, you are, that to the extent that your site is at some point in time considered and opened up for affordable housing development, the relationship of that property, that housing community, that community that would develop within that property, and the opportunity to have a relationship with the congregation is, in my mind, a really lovely connection and concept, which not all sites have. Sometimes we are looking at greenfield sites without much connection because that's what we can get, right? And without that connection to existing community, which can be really powerful.
Gus had his hand up, and then there's one more question in the chat, and then we should probably wrap it up. So Gus?
What does
Yes, we can.
Common Bound need from Prince of Peace in order to go ahead with a development project at our site?
Well, what I would say is important for us in pursuing any site, and particularly any site, and it's important distinction here, right? Because a lot of sites you acquire from, whatever, a farmer that just cut up their land, or a gas station that's going under, whatever it is, right? But what's important and different about this situation is that you are an existing community, faith community, who intends to remain present on the other portion of your site. And so most important in that situation, in order, if you were to proceed with affordable housing there, for it to be a positive experience for you and for those who would occupy that housing, is actually not the real estate side. There's plenty of work that has to be done with that, but is really to talk about what is the vision of Prince of Peace? What are you trying to accomplish in the world by participating in this way, by making this valuable, site potentially available for affordable housing? and to make sure that those aspirations can be reconciled with reality, so that if there are anything that you're hoping to accomplish, that you understand where the boundaries are based on, you know, how these things come together and all the federal rules, et cetera, et cetera. And that the role that you want to have, either formally or informally going into the future, that's understood by developer manager of the property and by the congregation, and that it's clearly enough mapped so that subsequent generations within the organizations can stay true to the original intent. That's something that kind of gets missed sometimes, you know? So a lot of times these kinds of understandings are reached between individuals, and trust is built between individuals, which is obviously important. But then it needs to be memorialized in a way so that anyone involved later can look back and say, yes, we are staying true to the original intent of the folks that made these moves.
Thanks. And then this last question, what is the lifespan of an affordable housing project? If a project is built as affordable housing, will it always be affordable housing? And how long are the buildings meant to last?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I'm glad somebody asked it. So this program that I was telling you about, that's present in almost all the deals that get done, one of the biggest critiques is that it doesn't create properties that are permanently affordable without additional considerable effort. So what happens is that the investment that's brought in from the private sector by virtue of this tax credit game, it brings a requirement with it, typically, that the affordability be preserved for 30 years, which is a long time. But at several junctures in that project life, there will be effort that's needed to retain that affordability. So after 15 years, that investor has the option to exit the deal. There's a bunch of work that has to go on to make sure that the affordability is preserved at that time. And then again, at the end of the 30 years. And for that reason, in my mind, it's really important that nonprofits, organizations who are mission driven, are in these developer owner roles, because the likelihood of that property at those junctures, right, when the affordability could be lost, that an entity with a mission is involved in the decision making and the considerable effort that's required to keep that affordability in place. The second part of the question is, how long are the buildings meant to last? As we all know, you know, anybody who's ever owned a home, so I would assume that's many of us on the call, you know, you don't just buy your house and then 50 years later think, oh, that was great, right? You are constantly investing in your home. How many times, you know, if you've lived in your home 50 years, like Common Bond has been around, right? You've probably replaced your roof 3 or 4 times. You've replaced, you know, 1 million water heaters, whatever. So we all know the level of investment that's required to keep up a home. It is the same in rental housing, right? So that kind of reinvestment is important to keep the quality and the longevity of the physical product up. The way the program is structured, though, this is another critique of the program. It does limit to some extent the major capital reinvestments you can make. So it does allow for us to do things like, you know, we have to repaint, we have to do water heaters, these sorts of more modest maintenance activity. But what the program does not allow for very well, except at these junctures at 15 and 30 years, are to do major systems replacement and major systems repair. So new roofs, re-siding, you know, really big ticket items, elevator replacement if there's an elevator, these sorts of things generally have to happen at these particular junctures where the credit program and all the underlying debt and everything gets turned over. So what you will see is that the properties, you know, we have properties in our portfolio that are older than our organization, right? That we acquired that had been built by other folks that we've acquired and stewarded since. So, so our goal as an organization is to never sell a building and to keep affordability in perpetuity, and to keep the physical and management quality of those properties at the highest level possible over that period of time. Again, not something to be assumed, but something to be looked for in a partner as you consider this. I just want to thank you all again for having me today and for the interest you're showing in this subject. I'm happy to talk with any of you at any time about more questions.
Thank you so much, Deidre, for being with us today. This was really informative and helpful, and speaks to so many of the current issues going on today that we really appreciate your time spent with us this morning.
Great, thank you.